I don't know what you said about me, but there was a couple of laughs there. Service console, RTFM, so something must still translate. Just in case you haven't come across me before, I used to run a website called RTFM Education. Read the fine manual. My new website is mikelaverick.com, where I'm kind of blogging and writing about vCloud Director. And I think I'm about to move off into looking at vCloud Automation Center is the next thing I'm going to be doing in the next 6 months. I joined VMware in August of last year. So I'm still the new boy, still making cups of tea for people and, taking messages on the telephone, but they will eventually allow me to do some real work at some stage. Apologies for anybody sitting in who's already seen this presentation a couple of days ago, because I'm going to use exactly the same jokes as I did then, because that's the nature of the beast. So my joke is always about my job title, and my job title is I'm VMware's Senior, Cloud Infrastructure Evangelist. Yeah. So 2 jokes about my job title. I haven't met any junior cloud infrastructure evangelists. So if anybody wants to apply for the position of junior cloud infrastructure evangelist, there is an opening. It's an intern position, unpaid, and your main role will be making Mike cups of tea, filling out my expenses, and doing all the sorts of things that juniors do. Yeah? So there are no senior or junior cloud infrastructure evangelists I've been able to find. So I guess it's just that kind of thing that happens with job titles. And then the other joke is this thing, evangelist, which I've always been a bit nervous about. Even though I wanted to be an evangelist, I myself felt a little bit kind of, woo, evangelism, isn't that? Got all these connotations of religiousness about it. So I say to people, what is an evangelist? No, seriously, what is an evangelist? And the evangelist role is to look not into somebody's eyes, but just above their eyes, and say that everything that VMware does is wonderful and great, and you should buy all our software. And you should come across as if you've had some sort of frontal lobe lobotomy during the last couple of months. So my intention is to be the evangelist, but not be like that, and be just who I was before I joined VMware, which was real, and not kind of drown you in kind of marketing stuff. Yeah. My session is all about vCloud Director and the things I've been learning about it. But before I get into that proper, I want to do some pimping. Last year, I wrote a book with fellow vExpert Barry Coombs, based in the UK. And we wrote a book together called Building End-User Computing Solutions with VMware View, which isn't really so much a title, more of a sentence. I wanted the word EUC in the book title, and Barry said, we won't sell any copies unless we have the word VMware View in it. So we ended up with this kind of mashed up title. But what it is 500 pages of content about VMware View, ThinApp, ThinApp Factory, load balancing with big IP from F5, Teradici, whole certificates, whatever you like. It's about $10 to download, I think about $25 for a hard copy. All the money for this book goes to UNICEF, and we're not taking a personal royalty at all. So if you're interested in end-user computing, interested in virtual desktops, please buy our book. It's full of really juicy content, and it goes to a good cause as well. Yeah. So end of the advertisement. EUCbook.com is where you go to get hold of this thing. The session is all about vCloud Director and my lab environment. And I was thinking about you guys out there in the community and how you're going to learn new technologies, not just from VMware, but from other vendors as well, given the resources you have. So there's a bit of a narrative there. But before I actually get into it, I wanted to ask a couple of questions and do a bit of a straw poll. Who here has a home lab of their own? Stick your hand up if you've got a home lab, because it's very popular within the VMware community. Yeah? Okay, put your hands down. Put your hand up if you don't have a home lab. Yeah, there's still a sizable number of hands coming up. So at the end of this session, the people who put their hands up and who said, I don't have a home lab, go to the person who put their hand up and said they did and ask them why. Don't get it from me, ask it from them. Yeah. For those people who put their hands up, why do you have a home lab? Why do we, don't you get enough of IT during the day that you come back at night or weekends and you do more IT? Unpaid? Why do you do this? Are you crazy? So, I mean, I'm not asking a rhetorical question. Why? Shout out, why do people have their home labs? Practice? Try out new technologies? Maybe do something in your home lab that you don't do in production? Maybe the business you work for don't have the resources to have a test bed? Yeah? VCP? Prepping for your VCP? Yeah, you can read it all in a book if you want to, but where you really learn is doing it, isn't it? Yeah? What are all those things got related to each other to a greater or lesser degree is, I think the reason people have home labs is career progression and career survival. You don't rely on your businesses that you work for to push you forward to learn new technologies. Because in some of the businesses I've worked in, I've been brought in, I've done this wonderful work, and then I've said to my manager, what do I do next? And he goes, just maintain what we've got. Okay, all right, I'll maintain it. Operational stuff is still valid, It's not just installing, getting it stood up and running. I've got to maintain it, and you learn something like that. Another 6 months go by. All right, what's the next project I'm going to do? Just keep on doing what you've been doing already. At that point, I get nervous because I start to think that my skill base is being slowly eroded and destroyed by the fact that this company isn't got the vision to do something new or push things forward. Yeah? I was doing this presentation for a while, actually, across different VMUGs, and I realized that my whole career I've had a home lab, but I never called it that. Back in 1993, I just graduated. I got a job at a training company teaching Lotus 123 for DOS and Word on Windows 3 to people who didn't know the difference between the Shift key and the space bar. That was my first job. Yeah? Can you imagine what that was like? No, the Shift key. The Shift key. No, that's the Tab key. The Shift key, the one with the big arrow on. Arrgh! Yeah, so I did it for about a year and a half, but boy, do you learn how end users are like and what it's like to learn something that you've never seen before. But during the weekends, I had a PC at home, a 486DX something, and I would install other bits of software I didn't know, and I would try and learn that in an effort to pick up new courses. If you taught more courses, you got paid more. The more courses you taught, the more you knew, the more likely, if something new came along, they'd pick you to do it rather than the person who'd been teaching Word, and all they did was teach Word. And I began to realize I've been doing that all my life. Yeah? When I wanted to learn Novell NetWare, I didn't have BNC connectors at home and coaxial cable, but there was a lab environment at work. So I'd go into that lab environment during the weekend and learn all about IPX, SPX numbers on Novell. Yeah, how exciting and thrilling that is, eh? Wonderful and exciting. But that's the general gist of this. What I'm getting at is I think as a community, those people who didn't put your hands up, okay, maybe you're a manager. I don't know what you do, so it's not for me to judge. But if you're remotely a technical person, then maybe you should have some sort of lab environment that you can work in. I believe in the current economic crisis, that's what it is, especially here in the Eurozone in Europe. The days of large companies sending its staff onto training courses to teach them about new stuff, the first thing that gets cut in a downturn is staff development and training. I know, because I lived through 4 recessions, each based through being an instructor where the source of training and work dried up. So that means you've got to invest in yourself if the companies are not going to invest in you. Thus ends the sermon on why you should have a home lab. Yeah? But that's where I'm coming from. I want to talk about my lab and how I've learned stuff about vSphere and learned something about vCloud Director. That's what this session is about. It occurred to me after I wrote this presentation and I delivered it a couple of times, I was using a couple of terms in vCloud Director, which for me now it seems very natural, but if you've never installed or used vCloud Director, would be foreign to you. So here's like a 1,000-foot view of some of the terms and what they mean. The provider VDC, yeah, is basically an object in vCloud Director that can point to a cluster in vSphere. Yeah? What was new in vCloud Director 5.1 is this provider VDC can now contain many clusters, not just one. Yeah? So it's the thing that shows resources to your tenants in the cloud. You have this thing called the organization and the organization VDC. Now the org is like, I don't know, a logical boundary. I can only log into this org because I know the username and password. And then I see virtual data centers, production, test and dev, and so on, where I can deploy virtual machines. Yeah? Obviously, those VMs need access to the network. Yeah? So we have this thing, not just the org network, but something called the VApp network, org networks, and external networks. My joke about this is, and I don't know whether this will translate in Italy, but there's a very famous song which goes, the knee bone connects to the leg bone connects to the ankle bone. Do you know that song? So I made this joke of the VApp network connects to the organization network, and the organization network connects to the external network, and the external network connects to the internet, and hear the word. That's what I was thinking of. So you have all these sorts of links between them. Incidentally, VApp networks are optional. What I've discovered is a lot of customers actually put their VMs directly on the org network. Where VApp networks seem to be used very frequently is in test and dev environments, because the VApp network has this thing called network fencing, which allows you to spin up loads of VMs and not have to re-IP them. They're in their own little bubble. But a lot of other VMs, the ones that you want to live for a long period of time, tend to go on the organization network. Yeah? They are all backed to a greater or lesser degree by the distributed virtual switch, but more importantly, something called network pools. And you can have different types of pools. Don't worry about that. Yeah, that's Scott's job to worry about those things. Yeah, all these different network layering. But the main thing to say about a pool is you go, I want a network, and it just grabs it from the pool, and you can have networking. You don't have to think about, was that VLAN based? Was it port group based? Was it through my Nexus 1000V? You just don't think about it anymore. I want a network out of that particular pool. Yeah. You also have IP pools associated with these as well. So you don't have to think about, oh, what IP range should I use for this network? I'll just make one up. It's all fenced, yeah, that kind of thing. But you don't really need to know anything about vCloud Director to get something from this session. To be honest with you, you could decide to actually not use vCloud Director and use a competing product. You would be probably faced with exactly the same conflicts and challenges that I've been facing for the last 6 months. It just so happens that I work for this company called VMware. How did that happen? And it just so happens that my experiences are all based around using vCloud Director. But in all honesty, I think you could go to the generic on this sort of stuff. What's not generic is the virtualization stuff, because that's obviously vSphere. So a little bit of backstory about where I was with my lab. In a long time ago, in a galaxy far away called 2003, my first attempt to install ESX2 was to a Dell Optiplex PC that was underneath my desk. That was my home lab. And I was shocked to discover it didn't work at all. What's going on? Back then, the only IDE controllers that ESX2 recognized were ones that were probably on IBM blades, because early IBM blades didn't use SAS drives and SAS controllers. They used IDE disks. In fact, as far as I know, that still could be the case. I don't get involved in the weeds so much. Impact on girlfriend, nil. We weren't living together. It's just a PC. So, like, you know, it's not a problem. One of the things that you'll always face with home labs is what the Americans sometimes call wife acceptance factor, or WAF. Yeah? The bigger the lab, the more you get into trouble. And I guess there are females in the audience. You could call it husband acceptance factor if you wish, you know. So I was speaking to a lady just yesterday, a lady called Lauren Malhoit. She runs a podcast called adaptingit.com, where she specifically interviews people who work in IT who just happen to be women. What a shock horror. Yeah, there were women in IT. I didn't know it happened. But she was telling me she has a server in her own bedroom. Yeah? So I said she probably will have, at some stage, significant other kind of acceptance factor, because a server in your bedroom, it's not really conducive to, you know, married life, you know. I don't know how to make this any more clearer, but, you know, when you're doing your lover man thing and you've got the Belgian chocolates and the fine wine and the, I don't know, Barry White or maybe even Marvin Gaye, Let's Get It On in the background, somehow the sound of in the background is not going to help you, yeah? So there will come a point where you need to move on to something else, yeah? So what I've done is missed out the whole evolution of my lab, which is a bit tedious, My longer presentation on this actually covers how my lab developed over time. But I'm now in a co-location facility in the UK called Node 4 in Derby. They have about 3 or 4 facilities. I have 2 Equalogics arrays at the top there. I've got 2 NetApp arrays. Somewhere in between here is actually a fiber channel switch and a Dell Power Connect. I've got a bunch of HP DL385s, generation 1s, circa 2007. They should really be in landfill. You can still get these on eBay for about 50 euros, and they still take ESX5, and they also take the next version as well, but less about that. And down at the bottom, I've got some Lavono TS200s, which I bought when I actually was in a home lab for a very short period of time. I actually had a home lab and what I called the Pro Lab, and then I decided to merge the 2 together to get more compute. Yeah? So not content with 1 lab, might had 2. Yeah? Well, that's an entirely different story. The bad news is this is really expensive. It costs me £870 a month to run this in the co-location facility, which for our American cousins translates roughly, depends how much my currency is devalued in the last 2 seconds, are around $1,300 US. Yeah? So it's a massive burden. And every day, every week, I think, can I still afford to carry on doing this? Yeah? I've got some sponsors on Laverick.com, but they don't cover the whole bill. Yeah? Can I go to my manager and say, hey, I need money to fund my lab? Or is he going to say, Mike, that's your problem? Yeah? You had this lab before you joined VMware. Why should VMware pay for your lab? Seems reasonable enough to me. On the plus side, me and the girlfriend are getting married. Yeah? Thank you. All I asked to do is get down on one knee. And, you know, she had the difficult part, agreeing to marry me, you know. We're getting married on the 4th of May. May the 4th be with you. Bridesmaids dressed in stormtrooper outfits. Yeah? No wedding march. Do, 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 do. As she come, no, I'm not joking, obviously. But I tell you what, I say that she's happy about this, but she knows how much this costs me. And even with the phenomenal amount of money that VMware pay me to tweet all day, yeah, because that's my main job, I get paid to tweet. Joking, of course. She looks at this and goes, well, this would buy us the dream home in the country that we say we can't afford. Yeah, that's true. This would pay for that holiday in Venice that we're going to have after our wedding. Yeah, that's true as well. So I have to justify the wife acceptance factor, this spend. The way I've normally done it is said, without this kit, I wouldn't be able to work, and if I couldn't work, then there would be no house for us to live in. That's how I justify the spend on the lab. And I could do that when I was a freelance, self-employed person. That's harder to do now. I'm backed by a big company because her view is, well, doesn't VMware just have racks and racks and racks of servers that they can just give you to use all the time and play around with? And I'm like, it doesn't quite work that way, honey. You know, it's not like that. It's not like there's just racks. There's a whole data center that Mike can just have for his own use. It's not quite run that particular way. Run a bit more efficiently than that, you know. So what I want to do next is just talk about how that kit was set up previously. Now, I could go through this bulleted list, but it's actually quite tedious. What's nicer is to see pretty pictures, yeah? So my world before getting into cloud was dominated by Site Recovery Manager, SRM, which I'm sure some of you know. There are some books that we're going to be raffling off, and I think we have an SRM book, or version 5. And if you know SRM at all, there might be a few people who do. There's often a process of having 2 virtual centers, yeah, and mapping your networks, VLAN 11, over to your networks over here, VLAN 51, mapping compute resources over here, clusters or resource pools, and so on. So it's a multi-site configuration. I had New York and New Jersey in the same rack in Derby. Now, that's what I call consolidation. Yeah, 2 cities in 1 rack. Fantastic, yeah? Now, where have I gone? Well, when I joined VMware in August, I took the opportunity to basically level the kit because vSphere 5.1 came out just as I was joining the company. So I thought, well, I'm going to be doing something brand new, which is this vCloud Director stuff. And it's not just vCloud Director, it's the whole cloud suite stack. Why don't I do a kind of root and branch, level the playing field and start again? So this is what I've done. I am using the Virtual Center Server appliance. Yeah. What I found interesting about Duncan's session this morning is I didn't know what the configuration maximums were, and I think I'm probably exceeding them. But it works perfectly fine. I guess it is a lab environment, not production. But I've got more than 5 hosts. Was it 5 hosts and 50 VMs? Yeah, I didn't realize that. Perhaps I should have read the manual, shouldn't I? Oops. Yeah, well, less about that. The main reason for doing this is I wanted to get rid of the Windows Virtual Center and, more importantly, the Windows SQL box. Because what I wanted to do was maximize the amount of resources I had and minimize my footprint in terms of VMs I needed just to make our junk work, make the vSphere and vCloud Director junk work. I've since discovered actually that the amount of CPU and memory we assign to this appliance isn't that much different from having 2 Windows boxes and one being SQL anyway. But I guess what I've done is now I only have 2 instances to worry about rather than 1. The other thing I did was I used the vCloud Director appliance. Now, it's not supported in production environments. It's demo only, demonstrations, evaluations. It's not production ready. It does not support multiple cell configurations and load balancing. But it is really easy to download, give it an IP address, and you're up and running. Yeah. I think it would be fair to say that anybody here who's installed vCloud Director, stick your hand up if you've done it. It's not the easiest of installs to do. And if your goal is, I've got a few hours while my girlfriend or wife is out doing something to do a bit of lab work, what you don't want to do is invest a lot of time in watching status bars go by. You want to actually get in and learn something or do something. So you want the on-ramp to be as low as possible to getting your thing up and running. Spending hours and hours installing things is actually quite a big waste of time, I think. Because where the interesting stuff happens is once the software is installed, not the installation itself, as you all know. So that's what I've got at the moment. Obviously, with, as you heard, the Virtual Center appliance, there's no linked mode with the Virtual Center appliance. So there's no role sharing or license sharing. So there is, not exact feature parity. What made me switch over to the appliance was I believe in appliances anyway, but also speaking to our Virtual Center guy, whose Twitter handle happens to be @VirtualCenterGuy, Justin King, I discovered that the APIs behind the virtual appliance are exactly the same APIs that I use with the Windows version. So for things like vCloud Director saying, spin up a resource pool, create a folder, that's the same on both. So I wouldn't run up against differences in that respect. Yeah. The other stuff I did, vShield Manager, VR, and so on, because I went appliance crazy, it's like, yeah, appliances, as many as possible. Yeah. Of course, vShield, now called VCNS, is a requirement of vCloud Director, so I couldn't really avoid that. When I was going through this process of putting together the vSphere layer, though, I often felt torn and challenged about how I was going to lay out my vSphere layer ready for vCloud Director. I had my SRM hat on at some points, and then I had my new cloud hat on, which was a new thing to me, still is new. And I guess the other thing I was torn by is I had the engineer part of my brain, yeah, the geek part of my brain. And then there was this cloud part of my brain that goes, simplify things. Make this a consumptive model. Make it easy for your consumers, the tenants, to easily use the resources. And the engineer's going, oh, well, that wouldn't work. And what about this particular setting? And I think that's probably the way the next couple of years are going to pan out as we tussle between trying to make things simple and easy for our tenants to consume resources, and then the engineer part of your brain going, oh, I wonder what the parity level is on that. Yeah? And it's like, sometimes I wish I could find the off switch for my brain, but I haven't located it again. So what I mean by this is, here's what I would say I think a lot of customers do when it comes to vSphere. Let's assume you have more than one cluster. Yeah? To be honest with you, this particular part of my presentation doesn't work if you only have one cluster, because it's like no point discussing it. But let's say you create 2 clusters. Yeah. Very often you'll find that those clusters will have obviously a number of ESX hosts in them. Yeah. And there'll be a discrete number of networks or VLANs that are accessible just to that particular cluster. And there'd be a discrete set of volumes or LUNs assigned to those clusters. for those people who are working in a multiple cluster environment, is that something that you do? Stick your hand up if you do that kind of separation. I'm not saying what you're doing is wrong. I'm just trying to reveal, peel back the kimono, as the Americans like to say, of my kind of thinking. Yeah. Do some of you have a LUN which is visible to both clusters and do that? Anybody do that at all? Fewer hands come. Can I ask, why is it that you do that?
Mainly for migration. It's just a temporary LAN. It doesn't stay there forever.
Yeah, you could have said, because I read it on Yellow Bricks, and Duncan said it was a good idea. The first time I heard of this actually was in the ESX2 book by Scott Herold and Ron Oglesby, who talked about the swing LUN, which I thought was a funny term, you know. The swing, the swingers. But it's about being able to move the workloads around. And what I think is interesting about that is we've created these barriers between these two environments. Why do we do that? Why do we create two separate clusters? What reasons might you have cluster A and cluster B? So it's not a rhetorical question. Why do we have more than one cluster? Why do people do it? Oh yeah, or even better still, what if this is AMD? And what if this is Intel? That's precisely my situation. My Livornos are Intel boxes. The DL385s, the 5 indicates it's an AMD processor. I can't make one big cluster, even though I've only got a couple of servers. I'll take your hardware differences, I guess we could say, but an even better example of that is AMD to Intel, because we can't do vMotion from apples to oranges, not yet. Yeah? Any other reasons? Security. This could be a PCI domain. Oops, my writing isn't very good. Licensing. Yeah, our friends Oracle. Yeah, don't we just love them and their licensing policies? Yeah. You know how VMware used to always get it in the neck over VRAM licensing? Yeah. When customers used to say that to me, I go, hang on a second, you've got Oracle? They go, yes. I said, look at their licensing policy, and then come back. Yeah. So, you know, if you want to see really evil licensing, you know, have a look at Oracle. In fact, my nickname for Oracle back then was, I'd say Orrible rather than Oracle. So I'd talk about horrible licensing, dropping the H. Yeah, horrible. Anyway, I shouldn't really, is this me going negative on Oracle? I perhaps shouldn't do that. It's on the public stage, but there we are. What if they are, somebody said security and I said PCI domains. I mean, a simple one is this is test and dev, and this is production. And we want to keep them separate. What I think's interesting about this, just to take away as an idea, not yes, wrong, whatever, how interesting that we, as people who are in the vanguard of virtualization, the evangelists inside our companies who tell people how great virtualization is, have decided that the best way of managing their resources is to partition them physically. Isn't that ironic? Does anybody here not see how that feels a bit odd? You know, if we're meant to be entering this world of the software-defined data center, why are we still doing it by the hardware data center methods? Can we not get that separation using software tools rather than have it physically separated? And that is the tension I've felt all the last 6 months. The engineer part of my brain, physically separate, guaranteed. But the new cloudy software-defined data center part of my brain goes, hey, that's the kind of old school method. Shouldn't we be using more flexible controls that we can reconfigure at a will, where we don't have to have a LUN that's visible to two clusters, have to power off the virtual machine to migrate it from one location to another, and then migrate it again off that storage before I can then have it run. It's great having the swing LUN, but it's a number of steps to go through. And unless you script it, it's all automated, isn't it? So I'm not saying what I've done in my lab is the right way. Let me get that important to you. I am not a guru or an expert. I'm still learning. And all I'm doing is sharing my learning with you. So if you disagree with what I've done in my lab environment, fine. What I'm just trying to do is be part of that process by we discuss, should we do it this way or should we do it that way? And I also think it's kind of funny in my own lab environment, I've done it both. So where I want hardware separation, I've done it. But where I want software separation, I've done it in software. So that's the way forward. Have your cake and eat it. Do both. Yeah, both hardware and software silos, and then no one can criticize you that you've done it wrong because you've used all the methods. Yeah. So this is what I've got in my lab environment at the moment. I created two clusters called Gold, and oops, let's go back a second. Gold and Silver, and what forced that was the CPU differences. And I thought that's quite interesting. I've just said, why do we define things by hardware? But at my first task, which was to create a cluster, I had to remember that one was AMD and one was Intel. Yeah? So I can have these grand visions of a capacity-based model where resources are delivered on a flexible, on-demand, elastic enterprise, yada, 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 buzzword, buzzword. But when it came down to it, I had to go, oh, AMD, Intel, they don't live together. Yeah? The hardware world came in and said, yeah, think again, Mike. Yeah? One big cluster with everything in, that doesn't work. Yeah? Also notice that I've got infrastructure resource pools. This is something you will see in your home lab. The ideal world of design in vCloud Director is to have a dedicated management cluster, separate and discrete from the clusters where your tenants live. But in your home lab, do you have enough resources to dedicate computers just to running Virtual Center and all those sorts of things? Or does your management layer sit on top of the very thing that you're managing? Yeah? Is that the case? Yeah. The reason that we avoid that in the production is because nobody wants to be the person sat on a tree with a saw in their hand, yeah, making changes to their environment that could affect the very management of the system that they're trying to, cutting their own branch off. That's something you're going to have to live with to some degree if you're in a home lab because you might not have the resources to have that separation. Yeah? You may have to take compromises. And that's what design actually is, isn't it? Design is all about compromise. It isn't about some fixed ideal of how it should be. It's about what we can achieve with what we've got and how we justify that. So all design is about compromise, but trying to keep the compromises as small as possible and as least painful as possible. So I ended up with one site, two clusters, the infrastructure resource pool because I didn't have a management cluster. My goal was to just max out as much memory as I had available because let's face it, in a home lab or in my lab, it's always memory that you run out first, not the other resources. It's always memory, memory, memory every single time. The separation of the clusters was forced by my CPU differences. There was nothing much I could do about that. Interestingly, the Gold cluster does have QLogic cards, but the Silver cluster doesn't because I haven't paid for them. I guess I could buy some. But if I did, I'd need ports on my fiber channel switch, and I don't want to buy another FC switch. So the only difference really beyond the memory in the CPU is that they've got access to different storage. Both clusters have access to iSCSI and NFS, but only one cluster has access to fiber channel at 2 gig. Yeah? I must admit, though, in my home lab, do I ever saturate my 2 gig fiber connections? No. So really, I'm creating a very artificial distinction, really, in a lab environment. But I'm trying to make it as realistic as possible, as you always do in a lab environment, so it's not that different from your production environment. Storage, I have a couple of volumes for my infrastructure, templates and software and things like that. Local storage all got dumped in one folder. And then I ended up with, not started out with, 4 tiers of storage. Your platinum, your gold, your bronze, your silver. Yeah? You'll laugh at this. Initially, I started off with 14 tiers of storage. Yeah? That was my engineer brain taking over. I've got 10 minutes. All right, I need to go a lot quicker. Yeah? So my engineer part of my brain was thinking, first LUN, replicated, fiber channel, 2 minutes. Second LUN, replicated, fiber channel, 10 minutes. Third LUN, replicated, fiber channel, 20 minutes. Until I had like 14 tiers of storage. And then I had to pull back from that. I began to realize I was engineering something so complicated that no one would be able to consume it. So when my tenants came and went, new VApp, and I presented 18,000 different layers of storage, where would they begin? So there's a compromise between wanting all that granularity and at the same time wanting to keep it simple. So the tenant goes, there's 4 tiers of storage. My analogy for this has been, when you buy a new mobile phone or you move from one telecom provider to another, when you look at the tariffs, unless it's, you can send as much data as you like, text as much as you like, call as much as you like, they have an infinitesimal number of different tariffs. And it's almost a brain ache trying to work out which is the right tariff for you. And is that tariff over here better than that tariff over there? It's too complicated. I think it's almost done deliberately to make it confusing, to make it harder to compare one tariff to a competitor. So, that's how I did my storage. I also use vSphere replication. My anxieties about doing this is my silver cluster and my gold cluster could see the same storage. So that quick video I did where there was separation, I don't have that. What I have is 2 clusters that can see the same storage, and they can also see the same networks as well. I actually think sometimes, I have these moments of self-doubt at night, and I think, I've done it all wrong. I've done it all wrong, it shouldn't be this way at all. But that's what I've done, to make it easy for me to move VMs from one cluster to another. But that does make me worry about noisy neighbor. Somebody in my silver cluster could generate a lot of disk IOPS on the volume which is actually being used by tenants in the gold cluster. And the gold people in the gold cluster won't be very happy about that, will they? Because they pay extra for the gold experience. That's like you being in business class and just behind you is some drunken person in economy making your experience unpleasant. You've paid for business class, but you're getting the experience of this idiot behind you in economy class. We generally, when we pay for something, expect a quality service if we're paying a premium for it. The other thing I worry about is my site recovery manager engineer head. I've only got 4 tiers of storage. If I replicate all those LUNs to another site, how will SRM integrate with that? That's why I think things like vSphere replication, which liberates you from the lunacy of the LUNs, being able to replicate individual VMs is going to be so important. And without talking too much about futures, this vVols thing, anybody here heard about vVols? Where the VM has its own volume. And as far as I understand it, you'd have to ask Cormac about it because he's the real storage guy. That's inside another volume. So you can do replication on a per VM basis, even at the array level. Freeing us from these sorts of constraints, because the storage that we have isn't really geared up for that kind of multi-tenancy kind of experience, but it has to be if this cloud thing is going to go anywhere. From a network perspective, I have an infrastructure distributed virtual switch, and I have a virtual data center distributed virtual switch. Basically keep the traffic that's management separate completely from the tenants. And that's on different physical NICs plugged into different physical switches. So Mike, who's against the silo, chose on the network level to actually have a silo. Oops. So I fully admit that I'm not consistent in my views. So I tried to get rid of standard switches. vCloud Director works so much nicer and so much smoother and so much easier with distributed virtual switches, so I wanted to get rid of those. But I obviously still needed to keep my management network separate from my tenants. I can't have my tenants being able to see vMotion traffic. That's just not right. So I had network identity anxieties. I think the separation also came from me worrying about me going and touching one of the distributed switches, changing a setting and then affecting all my tenants. Or the other way around, doing something in vCloud Director that should just affect my tenants but actually affects my own management layer. My view environment runs on the cluster that runs vCloud Director. So if something goes wrong, I can find myself sawing off my own branch to this co-location facility. And if I screw that up, I will be getting in the car and driving to the co-location facility to fix the problem. So that's what I was worried about. I think I've done enough to separate them. So some lessons learned. Think about the provider VDC. Think about all the resources of the cluster, but you might find there are physical differences. My gold cluster doesn't have FT, but because you can only protect a certain number of VMs with FT, I almost forgot about it, disregarded it. VXLAN should really be configured before you go about installing vCloud Director, because vCloud Director 5.1 assumes that VXLAN is already set up and creates network pools for it. If you don't, you'll get 2 red X's for each of your 2 distributed virtual switches. It's not a worry, but it's just not very nice the first time you use a product to get a red X. You think something's gone horribly wrong. If you're using VLAN backed or whatever, you are not using VXLAN, it's not a problem. Watch out for your lab environments at home where you've already got VMs running on the cluster. When you set up vCloud Director, it does try to install an ESX agent or vCloud agent, and it does that by putting every single ESX host into maintenance mode, which, if it's not quick enough, you might find 1 or 2 of the ESX hosts just don't get the agent installed. It's not the end of the world. You just right-click the host, install agent, and it will work. But because you don't have a dedicated management cluster and blank ESX hosts, sometimes that can be a bit of a snafu. Some more lessons learned. Get your VLANs sort of sorted out before you even begin. In my home lab, I didn't have any VLANs. It was a flat network. And a lot of home labs are just a flat network because it's just a home lab. But as soon as you start using vCloud Director, you will need some VLANs of a certain description. And what you might want to avoid is arbitrarily changing VLAN numbers. So I set up a VLAN for one of my external networks on VLAN 11 on the physical switch, VLAN 11 on the distributed virtual switch, and then I pointed vCloud Director at that. 11, 11, 11. And then I went, you know what? I really don't like the number 11. Yeah, it offends me. I'd rather it was 10 rather than 11. So I changed it on the physical switch to 10, changed it on the distributed switch to be 10, refreshed vCloud Director, and it said 10. Brilliant. Everything's rose in the garden. And then I went to create another VLAN called VLAN 11, and I got this error message. In the database, vCloud Director thought that VLAN 11 was already in use. Yeah? Solution to this particular problem, there's a KB article that will walk you through it. Either edit the database to pull out the entry, or if you've not deployed that much, delete the reference, which will also delete the reference in the database. But the problem wouldn't have occurred if I'd done a bit of pre-planning. And the problem wouldn't have occurred if I'd gone, oh, well, I think I'll make that 11. Oh, maybe I'll make it 10. I hope you don't run your production environments like this, yeah? That you plan out before you begin. But in home labs and in test and dev labs, you tend to be less rigorous in your planning, and that can cause as many problems as it does in production. Yeah? Sort out your IPs before you begin. My IP range, my external network is on 192, my organization network on 172, and my vApps on 10. Yeah? So class A, class B, class C is completely the wrong way around in my view, to be honest with you. What I should have done is made my external network 10, or if I was pretending to be like an ISP, maybe the external network for organization 1 would be 16 IP addresses that are internet facing. And if they want more IP addresses, then I sell them IP addresses. Yeah? So the external network can actually be genuine IP ranges, and you sell them to your tenants. Yeah? And then organization network 172, and my vApp network's using 192. Why was I using 192.168.3? Well, my Wi-Fi router at home, it used 192.168.3, and I thought, what a great IP range. I'll make everything use that. Yeah? Perhaps not so smart. I'll keep it very brief. Okay. So IP ranges can be a bit tricky to change, so make sure you plan it up front. Yeah? There's a tick-off box that you can set to retain IP addresses and MAC addresses on the vApp network. Very useful to enable this if you're putting in static IP ranges. If you don't, then when you shut off the vApp, you can lose those static entries. Have a good naming convention. This guy here, he's a man sucking an egg. I'm sure you've all been on training courses where they've said to you, have a good naming convention. But if you don't, when you do pings and path pings and whatever, all you'll get is a bunch of IP addresses. If you've got a good naming convention, you can actually see traffic leaving an organization, going across the external network, down an organization, and into a VMAP. If the packets don't arrive at their destination, you can see where the traffic is being stopped. It guides you to where to do the troubleshooting. OVFs, are they as portable as we might like them to be? Read this error message. A virtual system in the OVF file is being uploaded requires an unrecognized virtual hardware version. I was trying to take a VM from vSphere 5.1, vCloud Director 5.1, and upload that to a public cloud vendor who is using vSphere 4.1 and vCloud Director 1.5. My hardware level was hardware level 9, but their hardware level, the maximum they could support would be, help me here guys, 7 or 8? Yeah. There's obviously compatibility. Yeah? We can actually pretend as if vSphere 5 is actually running previous versions, but there isn't forward compatibility. ESX4 can't pretend to be ESX 5.1. Yeah? So watch out for this, especially if you're thinking about moving VMs out of your domain or into another domain. Your lab, what are you going to do? This is for the people who said they don't have one. Have I got 60 seconds left or something like that? This is like Mission Impossible. You know. This message will explode. My presentation will explode in less than 10 seconds. So there's a couple of options. You could run ESX inside Workstation on Fusion on a mighty PC with lots of memory and hopefully an SSD drive to make the disk easier. Your other option, also related to this, is something called AutoLab by Alistair Cook. It builds out through scripting an entire vSphere environment with nested ESX hosts, ESX running on ESX. Whoa, yeah. A company called Bare Metal Cloud has taken Alistair's idea and they've cloned it with Clonezilla, an open source competitor, if you like, to Semantic Ghost. If you dial up a server on Bare Metal Cloud, they can get your AutoLab up and running in 30 minutes. So maybe you only need a lab for 6 weeks before you do your VCP and you don't want to spend the money on kit at home. You sign up for a service, you get your lab. When you're done with your VCP, you desubscribe, it doesn't cost you any money from that point. A real kind of subscription-based model. You could have machines at home. HP microservers seem to be quite popular with the Kingston memory, 2 gig of RAM, times by 2, you get 16 gig on them. They're meant to only support 8 gig, but with the Kingston memory, you can actually make it do 16 gig. No one, however, has been able to make them go up to 32 gig yet. Storage, iAmega, whatever. Maybe the future of the lab is that it'll all be in the cloud in the future. And at that point, I have to get off the stage. Thank you very much.